Descent of Man is a 2016 polemical work by the British artist and author Grayson Perry. Perry was born into a working-class family in Essex in 1960. He became a professional artist after studying art at Portsmouth, and in 2003, he won the Turner Prize. In 2008, the Daily Telegraph named him British culture's 32nd most powerful person. The subject of The Descent of Man, as Perry tells us in his introduction, is what I think masculinity is, and whether masculinity is working for us, making us happy. In my view, it's really two books of different quality which don't quite fit together. Book one, the not so good one, is about the flaws of British males in general. Book two, the much better one, concentrates on toxic masculinity, the sort that makes men beat up their partners, wreck communities, and take their own lives. There is a connection, but it's not properly explored. Book one, the less impressive one, identifies a powerful tribe, a small minority of our native population, who are, of course, white, middle-class, heterosexual men, usually middle-aged. These men constitute the default version of British maleness, and they call the shots in every area of public life. We live in a default male world, the author writes. Proving this, which Perry doesn't attempt to do, would be a huge undertaking and wouldn't necessarily sag into book two. For example, some people might reasonably suppose that conventional masculinity has as much to do with blue as white-collar culture. In traditional working-class families, men were often breadwinners while women stayed at home. Work was physically grueling, and you were best able to cope if you made yourself hard. That's now largely gone. Its associated expectations haven't. Anyway, Chapter 1 concentrates on male power in society, laying the blame chiefly at the door of the white middle classes. Although Perry thinks there's little difference between the sexes, he thinks society would be much better if there were more women in positions of power. Members of a representative parliament, he says at one point, would hopefully not vote for policies which unfairly penalise one gender, as the recent austerity cuts did to women. Diversity and power means having an inbuilt devil's advocacy. Which is optimistic. At the last election, according to YouGov, the proportion of men and women who voted Reform and Conservative was roughly equivalent, about 40%. And biological diversity might bear no relation to diversity of viewpoint. A capitalist society will arguably select for qualities like daring, self-belief, and ruthlessness. And if the sexes aren't intrinsically different, it's likely that women will increasingly adopt those qualities. So yes, we'll end up with more powerful women, but 40% of them will be Margaret Thatchers. Chapter 2 shifts the focus to clothing as a performance and is interesting partly because of its extensive autobiographical content. The author doesn't hold back on his own struggles with conventional masculinity, and he comes across as interesting and highly compassionate. He's against uniforms and suits in particular. Personally, I couldn't help wondering what the anti-elitist artists Gilbert and George might make of that. I genuinely don't know. Chapter 3, Nostalgic Man, is where the book really takes off. Its New York Times reviewer wrote, "The Descent of Man is too long. In the last third, Perry is reduced to stating poorly what he said well earlier in the book. He's begun to twist a dry sponge." I couldn't disagree more. It's here, in the last half of the book, that he really considers toxic masculinity, and he's able to apply some of the lessons that he learned in making his Channel 4 TV series, All Man. So-called default man doesn't appear, despite Perry's earlier claim that it's a kind of explanatory touchstone. The author comes across as insightful and empathetic and not hamstrung by his liberalism. At one point, he speculates that bringing back military conscription might help, though he stops short of recommending it. Ultimately, The Descent of Man doesn't pretend to be any more than a beginner's book on the subject. If this is the first book you've bought about gender, I am joyful, the author says. And I don't want to be too critical of it. It works well within its limited remit. Toxic masculinity has become even more of an issue since the book's publication in 2016. Incels and Andrew Tate come to mind. But if we're to tackle it, we need to acknowledge its global dimension. Women being stoned to death for adultery, being forced into marriage, even as children, having their genitals routinely mutilated, being burned to death as a consequence of dowry abuse. And obviously, that's not an exhaustive list. The problem is, where all of that happens, there's rarely thought to be anything toxic about it. It's just masculinity, plain and simple. And disturbingly, women are sometimes complicit, which is what makes any book that starts a proper conversation on the topic invaluable. For all its flaws, this one more than qualifies.